Welcome everyone. We're really, glad that you were able to make this webinar. We really appreciate the time um, for you to come and join us. Today, we're going to be speaking about ecological weed management for organic farms. This is something that I know it's a very important topic to many of you, and we're very uh, happy to have Dr. Carlene Chase presenting. She is a weed scientist and an expert. We'll learn a lot from her during this webinar. But before we do that, we do want to acknowledge that this webinar and a lot of the work that we're doing right now wouldn't be possible without the support from the USDA National Organic Program. This event is supported through the United States Department of Agriculture, specifically the Transition to Organic Partnership Program, TOPP. TOPP is a program of the USDA Organic Transition Initiative, and it is administered by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services, and as I mentioned, the National Organic Program. So we're thankful for them for all their support. TOPP is, especially here in the Southeast region, a program that is funding 5 key programmatic areas: farmer-to-farmer mentorship, community building, technical assistance and training. We are collecting data, as we know, with any USDA program and with many of the projects. We want to make sure that what we're doing is impacting farmers, and it's really making a difference in their farms and their lives. And also, finally, as part of TOPP, we're also developing workforce trainings and trying to support the new people who are entering the organic industry, organic inspectors and people who are basically knowledgeable, and they can help organic farmers. If you want to learn more about SC TOPP, we have a QR code for you here in this slide, but you can also visit the organictransition.org website, and to learn more specific information about the Southeast, you can go to that same page in the Southeast, where you can find all of the events and information coming up. All right. But before we go any further, once again, I was just mentioning that we're really fortunate. I've known Dr. Chase for several years now. Dr. Carlene Chase is an associate professor in the Horticultural Sciences department at the University of Florida. Her research and teaching appointment focuses on organic and sustainable cropping systems. She conducts research on ecological weed management, with an emphasis on evaluating cover crops and living mulches for weed suppression in vegetable and industrial hemp production, and also on improving water use efficiency in conventional strawberry production. She is a founding board member of the Southern Cover Crop Council and a member of its executive committee. As the chair of that research committee, she led the writing and establishment of the multi-state hatch project, which is S1085, Cover Crops for Sustainable Southern Agroecosystems, and served on the data verification teams for 2 cover crop decision support tools. Dr. Chase teaching includes undergraduate and graduate sections of weed management for organic and sustainable crop systems, and she's an associate editor and editorial board member of the Journal for Weed Science. As I said, I've known Dr. Chase for many years now. I've been lucky to travel with her to various places. She and I were lucky to be part of a group that went to Spain, took some students from the University of Florida to also learn more about organic systems in Spain, and also a project in the U.S. Virgin Islands that was supporting, also using organic cropping systems to address many of the issues that she will be talking to us today. So again, I'm very delighted to turn it over to Dr. Chase. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, JC. Let me go ahead and share. Okay. So today I want to go ahead and give you a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. And I just refresh your memory that there are 5 types of weed management practices. And we'll talk a little bit about what ecological weed management is and how it utilizes the many little hammers approach. And we'll go over some of those National Organic Program regulations that apply to pest management in general and weed management in particular. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion of how ecological weed management practices align with the 3 mandated levels of pest management. Those are the 3 levels of pest management mandated within the National Organic Program. And so those 5 types of weed management that I mentioned in the outline basically are preventive weed management, cultural weed management, mechanical and physical weed management, biological weed management, and chemical. And I have some examples of what that is. When I talk about preventive, I mean limiting human dispersal of weed seeds and weed vegetative propagules. And I say that because, as you would know, some weeds are propagated utilizing vegetative propagules like, say, tubers or rhizomes rather than seeds, or sometimes both types of propagules. In terms of cultural, we're talking about things like how do we manage the crop to make it more resilient to weeds. In terms of mechanical and physical, that's what equipment that we're using in terms of mechanical that we're using to suppress weeds or to manage weeds, and what physical pieces of equipment or options that we can use, like mulches or heat that we can use to kill weeds. Those come under physical. And then biological would be using microorganisms or arthropods or vertebrates to control weeds. And you're familiar with chemicals. In conventional systems, that includes herbicides and soil fumigants. Soil fumigants, as you would know, don't apply for organic systems, however. Okay, so what is ecological weed management and why is Carlene talking about that? So those are cropping systems that are less dependent on herbicides and rely more on ecological processes. And what processes are we talking about? Things like resource competition. That's competing for things like water, nutrients, and light. Also allelopathy, and that is when plants produce chemicals that can inhibit neighboring plants. Herbivory, that involves insect or livestock eating plants. Disease would be, utilizing some kind of pathogen to control weeds. And then seed and seedling responses to disturbance, that has to do with how does tillage and cultivation affect germinating seeds and establishing weedy plants. So the way in which herbicide use is reduced is by developing agricultural systems that are suppressive based on biological information. So the more you know about how the crops and the weeds in the system behave, the more you can use that information to control weeds. And then you also want to try to use many different options so that you're not just focusing on using one option almost exclusively because it works well, because you run into trouble with things like that. In conventional systems, they tend to use herbicides a lot, and as a result, they've run into situations with resistance. This type of approach really depends a lot on the farmer making decisions about how to manage weeds in the system compared to in conventional systems. You're prescribed, what is on the label, and you just follow the label of the herbicide. In this, you have to make a decision about how to design your system and what practices that you might want to use. And knowledge of those practices, that would be good, but you also want to know and utilize those practices that you think would be most effective on your farm. So you're trying to adapt these principles to site-specific conditions on your own farming enterprise. And so this kind of weed management, farmers have a greater responsibility for ensuring their success than in chemical-based systems. So this is a little slide that I put together to sort of explain the many little hammers approach. Conventional production really is very, very dependent on herbicide use. And so that's the big hammer, right? But whereas in organic production and in ecological weed management, you tend to use a lot of different practices and use them together to come up with a weed management strategy. And so that is called the many little hammers approach. So you're focusing on multiple options. So unlike conventional systems in which, farmers can just decide how to grow their crop and what inputs that they can use, that is not the case in organic systems, as you would be aware. The National Organic Program has regulations that by which farmers must follow in order to be able to certify their cropping system and their produce as organic. And so I'm going to cover some of those that are important for weed management. And this first one is the crop rotation practice standard. And that says that growers must use crop rotation, including practices such as sod, cover crops, green manures, and catch crops to provide a number of functions. And most of these three here have to do with soil health and maintaining a good soil. Whereas they do throw in one here that you should be aware of, that you should use these practices to provide for pest management in annual and perennial crops. And they start off by talking about pest management, and weed management is included in that. So there's also a specific crop pest, weed, and disease management practice standard in addition that really promotes a systems approach to pest management and discourages product substitution. So when a lot of people who are not familiar with organic systems, who want to get into it and have been just growing conventionally, they would come and ask, so what herbicides should I be using? And I will say, well, that's not how you do this. You don't start off with trying to figure out what you're going to substitute instead of conventional herbicides. And so you must start off by doing sort of cultural practices, focus on limiting the buildup and to manage crop pests, weeds, and diseases. And to do this, there are 3 different levels that are prescribed. And the first one is to design your cropping system so it's resilient to pests, weeds, and disease. And then if that is inadequate, you're allowed to move to level B practices, which are mechanical or physical. And I always add biological in there because you'll see that it does include biological as well. And then C, if A and B levels fail, then you can use a biological or botanical substance or a substance from the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. And so what I'll do is to sort of take you through what's allowed in these 3 different levels. So this first one, where we're designing a system that's resilient to pests and disease, so they advocate that you utilize crop rotation and sanitation measures for weed seeds. And also that you should be using cultural practices that enhance the health of the crop And that would include things like selecting very appropriate plant species and varieties that are appropriate to your growing conditions, to your farm, and also very competitive against weeds. So these two are that I circle with the purple, those are cultural weed management practices. Remember, I talked about those 5 different types of weed management practices, whereas the sanitation measures for weed seeds, that would be a preventive practice. So let's deal with the sanitation practices first, because we numbered our 5 types of weed management, if you recall that first slide, and preventive weed management was the first. And although you would find, several different types of weeds that disperse their seeds, they have adaptations for seed dispersal. In this case, wind, and in these cases, animal dispersal. Here, these are capable of floating, and this oxalis stricta is capable of explosive dehiscence. In general, most plants just shed their weed seeds at the base of the mother plant. Okay? And so that the majority of human dispersal of weed propagules occurs through human dispersal. And so we want to really focus on human dispersal of weed seeds and do things like try to prevent new infestation by being cognizant of what you bring onto your farm and how you move equipment around your farm. You want to control isolated weed patches. If a weed, you never noticed that before, that probably came in with, say, some transplants or something, and you notice that, you want to control that before that becomes a big problem. And when you do see weeds, you want to try to ensure that you control them before they produce seeds. And if you have some kind of exotic weed on your farm, as soon as that occurs, you want to try to eradicate that totally. So here's some examples. I just want to give you some examples of what prevention might look like. People might deliberately, a lot of those exotic introductions come because somebody goes to some country and sees a plant that they like and they want to bring it back. So they might see a cover crop that works really well in Brazil and they want to bring that to Florida. Well, you want to make sure there are laws that limit import of plants so that they don't become invasive. A lot of people like to share seed and save seed, and there are laws to ensure if you do purchase seed that the seed has a certain level of purity and minimal infestation of weeds in those seeds. Then there's a lot of movement of things in organic systems like manure that you might be using as fertilizer, just purchasing animal feeds if you have livestock. And when animals are transported, well, you want to try to prevent materials that are infested from getting onto your field. So if you're bringing hay, just be sure that you're not bringing in any kind of weed seeds with that. You want to compost processes like composting, manure, and making silage very often kills the majority of weed seeds in those materials. When you're transporting plant pots, you want to be sure to cover harvested commodities so you're not blowing weed seeds all over the place as you drive along the freeway. So that's preventive. What's cultural? Well, cultural has to do with how you grow your crop, right? And cultural weed management then is to how you use those crop management practices so that you benefit the crop and not the weeds, so that the crop is able to grow vigorously and suppress weed growth on its own. Okay, so what are some of those things we can do to facilitate crop growth and deny the weeds the ability to grow well and compete with the crop? You might want to select really vigorous species. So you want to select appropriate crop species, and within a crop species, cultivars or varieties usually vary in their competitive ability. So you want to select the most competitive cultivars. You want to promote early and uniform establishment. If you can get your plants to germinate and establish and grow quickly and close the canopy, then they compete more effectively against weeds. Also, you might want to select optimum crop density and row spacing and the planting pattern. You want to choose your planting date so that you might avoid the weediest parts of the season or be able to manage those weeds most effectively. You can actually manage your water use and also your fertilizer use so that it benefits the crop more than it benefits the weeds. And then I'll also talk about how you can use crop diversification in space and in time to advantage the crop compared to the weeds. So this is a photo that shows this fine leaf plant is lentils, and that you can see there's a lot of a broadleaf weed in there. That means the lentils are not doing very well. So this is what I mean. If you know the field is very weedy, then you want to select a crop with traits that allow you to effectively suppress the weeds in that field. So lettuce would not lettuce, but lentils would not be a good choice. So some kind of small grain would have been a better choice. So you're looking for traits like rapid growth and uniform emergence, tall growth habit. And, tall growth habit. So the growth habit matters. You also want to use optimal densities and row spacing that will allow you to the crop to rapidly grow and close the canopy so it's denying light to the weeds. And you want to select fields that would promote good crop growth. So is it a fertile soil? Does it have a high organic matter content to help hang on to nutrients? If it's a saline soil, you might want to avoid it. If it's not well drained, you might want to avoid it. So you want to select fields with good conditions that will promote vigorous crop growth. There are other things that you can do, like selecting seed that will really promote this uniform and early emergence. In crops like lettuce, when they're grown in places like Arizona and they're planting this time of year, it's still really hot and they don't germinate very well because of that. And so sometimes priming the seeds, and this is seeds on the left that are prime and seeds that are not primed, and you can see in lettuce that you can have much better emergence. Well, these plants would probably establish and compete with weeds a lot better than these. So you want to use healthy crop seed. You want to plant at optimal depths and use suitable fields and soils. You can use prime seeds. Some of these seeds do better if they're coated and include soil health technologies. The other thing you can do is not direct seed at all. Give the crop an advantage by using transplants. And so this information shows here when you direct seed tomatoes, they have a much longer critical weed-free period. So you have to weed for 70 days with those tomatoes, whereas if you utilize transplants, your weeding period is just going to be 35 days. So how do you use water to manage weeds? So you might want to place the water so that the crop has better access to it than the weeds. So notice they're using drip irrigation here. This is surface irrigation, drip irrigation. So just the surface of the soil and the rooting zone of the crop is watered, whereas in the row middles, there's no watering there. So you're going to have less likelihood of weeds in the row middles. This doesn't work too well for Florida in seasons with a lot of rain. But so this is subsurface drip irrigation. And you can see in this bean field that the drip irrigation tape is located several inches, maybe about a foot within the soil profile. And so this means that although it's buried under the row, the soil surface never gets wet. And so that zone of about the top half an inch or so that weed seeds germinate from is never receiving moisture in a situation where it's sort of a dry conditions. What about fertilizer? And these are some examples from sort of temperate crops, but in these temperate crops like wheat, barley, canola, and peas, they saw that weed biomass was lower and the yields of these crops were higher when they applied fertilizer in spring rather than in fall. So those farmers, not much to do in fall, so they would tend to apply fertilizer in that slow period to be ready for the spring. But in some crops, that was not a good idea. In wheat, where rigid ryegrass is a problem, grass was less competitive when the nitrogen was applied before the three-leaf stage of the wheat than if you applied it at later stages. And the one which probably is more applicable to Florida, in corn, they showed that split applications of the fertilizer with half at planting and half at corn emergence give a 50% reduction in weed biomass. So that was much better than applying all of the fertilizer upfront at planting. So things like this you can do to reduce the amount of competition that you get from weeds. So in terms of fertilizer, this is a photo from the Everglades where we plant sugarcane, and it's showing that they're banding the fertilizer in the furrows for the planting where the sugarcane will be planted, but that the row middles is not receiving any. So when you band the fertilizer, that promotes the competitiveness of the crop rather than the weeds. And so that reduces your incidence of weeds in the row middles that can compete with the crop. So what is this crop diversification thing that I mentioned? Well, you can use crop rotation to diversify the cropping system so that you'll be varying both the crop species. And if you vary the crop species, very often the management practices change. And so that you're alternating or have a sequence of crops and crop management species that makes it so that the weeds don't know what's coming at them. They always have something new happening. And also you can intercrop, so you can design your mixtures so that you close the canopy and you utilize the crops utilize the resources so that they're little or none left over for the weeds. So crop rotation then is essentially diversity in time, where you have two or more crops grown in sequence on the same piece of land. And that could involve either cash crops that are suppressive of weeds, or you can also include in the rotation silage crops, green manures, and cover crops. So in terms of using cover crops in those cropping systems, you might want to use those cover crops that in your conditions establish really quickly and close the canopy. They form a dense closed canopy to reduce the amount of light that gets to the soil. And this is an example of sun hemp and sorghum Sudan grass. And here's a mixture of sun hemp and pearl millet grown in biculture. And you can see they grow very tall, the canopy is closed, so there's not much light coming through for weeds to establish and do well. So how do cover crops then affect weed growth? So they do that in a number of ways. They can suppress weed seed germination and weed establishment. And just the presence of the cover crop on the soil changes the soil physical environment. For instance, the highs in terms of how hot the soil gets, it does not get as hot at midday and just beyond midday. And so what we call germination cues are absent. And so a lot of weeds that look for a high difference between the low soil temperature and the high soil temperature to know that the soil is bare to go ahead and germinate, they don't get that cue. And then if the cover crop is there, it can compete with the weeds. So that's another way. And then some, like say sorghum Sudan grass, produce allelochemicals like sorgolion that help to suppress weeds. Then you can use those residues from cover crops as mulch for weed suppression in a subsequent crop. And then cover crops, while they're growing, as well as their residues as mulches, can provide habitat for weed seed predators. What about intercropping, diversity in space? That is when at the same time you're growing 2 or more crops on that same piece of land. And that will limit the amount of resources that is available for the weeds. And it can include various mixtures. It could be mixtures of annuals, or sometimes you could be growing annuals with perennials or perennials together with other perennials. And I asked here, what's a living mulch? Because I'm going to jump in to say that sometimes the intercropping could involve intercropping the cash crop. In this case, it's a yellow squash, and in this case, it's broccoli. And we were intercropping, the living mulch was hairy vetch and rye, and here it was crimson clover. And so you can see very good suppression of weeds in this area, but you can see sometimes we do have some problems that you might need to work out with living mulches, because sometimes they can have some adverse effects on the crop as well. Oops, sorry, what did I do there? Okay. So you can also intercrop the green manures with cash crop. And in this case, this is showing the intercropping of cowpea with corn. And in addition to cowpea, you can use other leguminous cover crops, and like velvet bean or sun hemp and jack bean. And the advantage of these legumes is that they can fix nitrogen with the rhizobia bacteria that occurs in their roots, and so allows them to grow without needing like nitrogen fertilizer. And then they can then contribute nitrogen to the corn crop without the farmers having to add as much fertilizer to the corn. And in livestock systems, that also gives you forage that you can use for livestock. And in some of these can be used as food as human food. Here's a situation in Asia where they were intercropping a food crop, corn with red amaranth. And this red amaranth was able to be harvested by 40 days. You can notice that that is taking up the niche that might be occupied with weeds, so there are not very many weeds. And it's coming off at 40 days after seeding, so not bothering the corn crop too much. In fact, there was no effect on corn yield, and they had effective weed suppression and also observed moisture conservation. And the addition of that second crop allowed them to make an additional $870 per acre that they would not have normally made had they done just a monoculture of the corn. Okay, so those were the sanitation practices that constituted prevention. And then we talked about cultural practices. If those fail, as an organic grower, you are allowed to use level B practices, which include mechanical and physical or biological methods. And what are those? Well, what the regulations say is that you can use either augmentation or introduction of predators or parasites of the pest species. So in terms of weed seeds on your farm, things like that promote carrot beetles and small mammals like field mice will be able to eat some of those weed seeds. Also, if you provide sort of hedgerows or strips, within your farm that provide habitat for weed seed predators, then that also helps you manage weeds. So those are what they say specifically that are allowed for pests in general. And I just gave you an example of how it applies to weeds. But they also give several direct methods that apply only to weeds, not the other pests. And the first two are mulching with fully biodegradable materials And you see I have an example here of a brassica crop being mulched with straw mulch. So this is a fully biodegradable material. And then you can also utilize mowing. Now, mowing is not going to work in all crops, like it probably wouldn't work in this crop, but in a perennial crop, like an orchard crop or a vineyard, then mowing is a very effective method for managing weeds. The third is livestock grazing, and this is a photo of pigs at Frog Song Organics, where John utilizes pigs in the off season. He would grow a cover crop here, and then he'd have them come in and utilize the cover crop as food, and they also take care of any weeds that there might be. You can use other livestock, like this is an example of chicken tractors, and they were doing an experiment to see how long you needed to keep the chickens on the piece of land to ensure that you control the weeds, but you also didn't have any regrowth. And this is an example of using sheep in vineyards to control weeds. So the fourth method that's suggested for mechanical and physical control of weeds as a level 2 practice is hand weeding and mechanical cultivation. And so hand weeding just involves either pulling by your own hands, with your own hands, or using tools like hose to weed your crop. You can also use cultivation equipment, and I show some examples of some that can be used for different types of cultivation. So if you cultivate without regard for the position of the crop, that's called blind or full field cultivation, and things like a Fleckstein harrow is really useful for that. When you want to control weeds in the between row area, the interrow area, things like basket weeders or field cultivators or weeding discs or sweeps are useful for between rows, cultivation between rows to control those weeds. But you also need to control weeds within the row as well. And so tools like torsion weeders and finger weeders are useful for weeding the row within the row between the plants within the row. So increasingly though, we are moving to situations where there's automated mechanical weeders, and some of those that are currently or have been evaluated in the lettuce industry in the US. I've listed some of them here, from the Roboveta to the Goffard. And currently, they're the FarmWise and Stout that are utilizing machine learning rather than these utilize just cameras to sort of locate the crop so that they don't injure the crop. And these machines are for within row weeding. The FarmWise and the Stout are an additional level, and so they're even more expensive because they're using artificial intelligence, and the aspect of that is that they're using machine learning to be able to distinguish between the crop plants and the weeds, and so they're able to weed even closer to the weeds than these automated weeders. And here's an example, a photo of the Stout Smart cultivator. This is a before and after picture of cultivating with the Stout Smart cultivator, and you can see relatively small weeds that get even fairly close to the crop itself, and it does a very good job of taking care of those weeds. Okay, so there's also some physical weed management that I mentioned. And here are a couple of examples of how flaming or heat can be used for managing weeds. And this is a flame weeder using torches to kill germinating and establishing weeds. And this one is really new. This is the laser weeder by Carbon Robotics. And this is using lasers to kill weeds. This is a photo on the left of where the carbon robotics laser weeder was utilized, and this is an unweeded area. And so you can see a very good job of weed control. Okay, so the sixth method that can be used involves using plastic or other synthetic mulches. And these are allowed with restrictions, and I'll mention the restrictions in subsequent slides. But here are two examples. And what we have here is a recycled paper mulch that can be laid with your regular plastic mulch layer with some modifications. And here is a paper mulch that was sprayed as a slurry, and then it hardened to a consistency of egg cartons, and that's called hydromulch. This is not something that's commercially available, but you know, farmers can make their own machine and spray that, and it does a pretty effective job. Oops. So some of the restrictions: you can only use paper as mulch or compost feedstock, and you can only use newspaper or other recycled paper. It should not be glossy and should not have colored inks on it. And cardboard is regarded as paper, but the cardboard cannot have any glossy or colored inks, and no wax or fungicide on this. And the nice thing about using paper is that you can incorporate it into the soil at the end of the crop. Plastic mulch, you're restricted to petroleum-based plastic mulches, but you can't use PVC mulches. They have to be removed from the field at the end of the growing season. And for crops that are grown as annuals, they must be removed annually. And for perennial crops, like those orchard crops, the removal has to occur before the plastic starts breaking down and, you know, leaving bits of plastic all through the farm. So there are different kinds of plastic mulches, right? They typically use opaque mulches. They use these black ones for when they also need soil warming, and you use white on black ones for when you want to plant in the sort of in late summer for the fall season in Florida. But if you have nut sedges, that could be a really big issue because it does well on broadleaf and grass weeds, but not nut sedges. Nut sedges, their rhizomes from sprouting tubers can pop right through opaque mulches. Fortunately, there are plastic mulches which we call infrared transmitting films, and also clear films, which the rhizomes, when they are emerging from the soil, detect light through those, and they change into leaves. The leaf expansion occurs, and they get trapped under the mulch. In this case, they just don't emerge. In the case of transparent film during soil solarization, the temperatures get hot enough to kill those weeds. And here we have a situation with perennials where you can use weed mat to control weeds. I wanted to mention biodegradable bio-based mulch because you will read in the NOP that it's allowed. However, what's going on is that none of the commercially available products are as yet compliant with the USDA organic standards. So please do not use any of the biodegradable bio-based mulch that's currently available on the market. And if those practices fail to give you effective weed management, you're able to use something from level C. And that includes biopesticides and products from the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. And the important thing with level C is that you're only allowed to use them when A and B are insufficient. And then you also have to document the conditions under which you would use these in the organic system plan. And here are some examples of what that would involve. And so these are essentially non-synthetic herbicides. And this is weed farm is 20% acetic acid. And as you can see, it's EPA registered. Here is the EPA registration number, and it indicates on the label that it's for organic production. However, in addition to EPA registration, to use an organic non-synthetic herbicide, you need to have it has to be registered in Florida by FDATS. So some states require, in addition to EPA registration, you have to go through state registration as well. And so you can't use this if it's not registered in Florida. Suppress is one where the active ingredients are fatty acids, caprylic and capric acid. And this has an OMRI listed sign on it, and that means it is registered, not registered, but listed by OMRI. So it has been reviewed by them and found to be compliant with the NOP, and so they're able to indicate that on their label. And this is the kind of certificate they get, but this I blew this up to show the restrictions that are listed on here. You have to have used these preventive, mechanical, physical, and other pest, weed, and disease management practices first before you can utilize this kind of product. In addition to being OMRI listed, is also a registered input material listed by Washington State Department of Agriculture organic program. So these two, the OMRI and the Washington State Department of Agriculture, are two good sources of information for you to find out whether your product is approved or allowed for use in organic systems. So in addition, it's possible to use bioherbicides. None of them are actually at this point registered for use or OMRI listed or listed by the Washington State Department of Agriculture, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what is possible, that basically you'd be applying a large number of biological control agents to induce rapid death of the weed population. And it's a temporary suppression. So just like a synthetic herbicide, you have to reapply as necessary for chemical herbicides. It's appropriate for annual cropping systems in which you're needing the weed suppression to occur quickly to limit the amount of yield loss that you have. And I wanted to give you an example of a product called Solvanix that was developed by Dr. Charadathan right here at University of Florida for the control of tropical soda apple in livestock systems. And it's essentially the active ingredient is a virus. And because it can affect peppers and tomatoes, which are in the same family as the tropical soda apple. It is restricted in where it can be used. And basically this causes the plant to have an overreaction to the viral infection, and it just sort of has this self-destructive systemic hypersensitive response. And so you initially see these kinds of lesions and yellowing, and then over a couple of weeks and then about a month, you see this sort of wilting and necrosis that occurs. So in addition, you can use substances from that national list, as I mentioned. The only things that are approved on the national list that's applicable for weed management are those mulches that I spoke of before. And also, there are soap-based herbicides. Excuse me. But these soap-based herbicides, you can only use it on sort of non-food areas of the farm for farmstead maintenance. And if you have fields that are dedicated to only ornamental crops, then you can use them, but you can't use them in food crop areas of the farm. And examples of these are Axe and phenylsano, and the fatty acid active ingredient is ammonium nonanoate. And the whole one of the restrictions, right? The whole idea is that any substances that you use has to be used in such a way that it doesn't contaminate crops, soil, or water. So I added these couple of things that are don't really fit in too well, but are really useful for falls and for weed management in organic systems, and they're called falls and sale seedbed preparation. And what you do is that you till the soil to encourage weed seed germination, because that active tillage provides a lot of germination cues for weed seeds. And then you irrigate as necessary if you're not having rainfall, so you can stimulate that weed seed germination. And then you complete your seed bed preparation because you want to have minimal disturbance after this step. So you want to incorporate any fertilizer and any soil amendments that you need to add and make sure that the seed bed is smooth and ready for planting. Then you want to kill the weeds 2 to 3 weeks later with minimal or no soil disturbance. And that's the difference between stale and false, that false, you have minimal disturbance. And I'll jump through this. This is just showing that you're using a shallow cultivation as the disturbance. And in the stale seed bed, you either use thermal weeding or you can use an approved herbicide. So there's no disturbance at all. And so the less disturbance, the less likely you have to bring more weed seed to the soil surface. And so I really want to point out that all of these methodologies that I've shown, that by their own, none of them are a big hammer. So that you really want to employ 2 or more practices to really do a good job of managing weeds in your cropping system, in your organic cropping system. And this figure just emphasized this, is where they used several different cultural practices, and they showed not much reduction in weed biomass if you use one cultural practice, but you have a significant improvement if you use 2 cultural practices. And if you use 3 cultural practices, you can more than double the weed biomass reduction. And that happened in both crops that they evaluated, maize and sunflower. And so I will stop there and open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chase. Yeah, there are actually several questions. We have a few minutes left. We'll try to get through all those questions. Just want to remind people there will be a recording of today's webinar. Hopefully we'll be able to get to your questions. We appreciate the time, all of you, for just joining us today. So here's and some of these questions you might have already answered, Dr. Chase, but I'm still going to read them for the benefit of everyone who tuned in today. What is a catch crop? Is one of the questions.
Oh, that's a good question. So a catch crop is when you have, at the end of your cash crop, sometimes there's residual fertilizer from that crop in the soil. So when you remove the residues, you might mow it. And so say at the end of spring, you had a crop and you think that there's going to be some residue of your fertilizer there. And you don't want the summer rains to leach that remaining fertilizer into the soil, into the groundwater. Then you can plant a cover crop that's designed to utilize that residual herbicide. So you might plant a grass cover crop, for instance, and so that would use up the residual fertilizer and hang on to it so it doesn't get leached. And then it could be released when you you plow under that crop, then it would release those nutrients for your subsequent fall crops. And so that's catch crop, is to catch that fertilizer, basically.
Great. Another question is there organic approach to controlling elephant grass in South Florida?
Elephant grass.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking elephant grass. Is it a perennial? I know it's elephant because it's big. So the difference between controlling annual grasses and perennial grasses is that the perennial grasses usually have some kind of vegetative propagule, right? So they might have rhizomes or something underground that they will keep sprouting from. So if you just mow it, it's just going to keep coming back. So if your grass has a rhizome, what you want to do is you want to use disc that soil, use a tillage operation that cuts up those rhizomes into small pieces, and then do a tillage operation that inverts and buries those pieces of rhizome as deep as possible, 10 centimeters or more. And because what happens is when they start sprouting, it depletes them of nutrients before the sprouts can get to the soil surface and photosynthesize. And so that's a way to manage perennial grasses.
Okay. Another question is, which cover crops produce allelochemicals?
Okay. So off the top of my head, there's evidence that definitely ones like sorghum Sudan grass that's sorghum is in their name. They produce sorgoleone. It's been very difficult to demonstrate allelopathy, because to be actually sure that what you're seeing is allelopathy and not resource competition, you have to actually identify the specific allelochemical or chemical in the plant that's doing the inhibition. And so a lot of situations we find phytotoxicity that we think is allelopathy, but until
Right.
we can identify the specific chemical, we can't call it allelopathy.
Okay.
So I would say definitely some of the small grains there. Rye is one of the small grains that demonstrates allelopathy, and definitely sorghum Sudan grass. We think sun hemp, but we haven't identified what the allelochemical is in sun hemp.
Okay. Here's a sort of a long, and I'll try to read it. Organic row crop producers rely heavily on cultivation as their primary means of weed control. These producers give me 1 second, may cultivate 7 or more times throughout the growing season. Based on 506-2026, which is the organic regulations, this method of control is preferred over using organic herbicides. And you obviously talked about, when herbicides can be used as the last line of defense. Can you please explain why excessive cultivation is more ecologically friendly than using organic herbicides?
Well, the thing is, it's you need to go back to cultural practices, right? And go to think about what they said about practices that sort of preserve and enhance soil health. So you're allowed to use tillage and cultivation, but you should not be using it excessively,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So again, we need to go back to the many little hammers approach and say that I think I need to use some cultivation, but to ensure that I don't have to do it 7 times in a season, why don't I make sure and utilize cover crops in my off season so I can suppress weeds? Why don't I try to use mulches in some of those crops that are not very competitive? Why don't I use rotation so that I rotate vigorous weed suppressive crops to help me clean up my fields before I plant crops that are less competitive? So you need to design your system so that it's resilient to weeds, so that you avoid having to use cultivation, to depend only on cultivation. So if they're depending on cultivation to that degree, it means they're not utilizing their level A practices
Right.
as well as they should.
Right. Right. Yeah. What are some good examples of living mulches?
So I showed some examples. Crimson clover in winter crops in Florida works in some parts of the state. I would say from North Florida and from North Central Florida and further north, crimson clover will do well because it germinates well, but it doesn't grow, so it will compete effectively with the crop, especially if you delay seeding it to a week or two after the crop. So that's the thing about you want to try to really find things that are low growing, and you want to find things that are if possible, legumes, because then they're less likely to compete with your crop for nitrogen.
Okay. Okay. Um, Andoni Reese is asking, I have a field with heavy fungal and nematode pressure. I've been researching for a cover crop that will help with this issue, and sesame seems promising for my region in Palm Beach County. My question is there a research field, anecdotal even, using sesame for summer cover crops in South Florida?
I
And there
use
is,
sesame.
what would you recommend, basically?
So I've used sesame in North Central Florida, and it's grown very well for me. It really depends on what your nematode species is. So you would need to figure out what your nematode species is. If it is either root knot nematode or sting nematode, then sun hemp works really well against those. Sesame, the problem with sesame, although it's worked well for me, it's hard to get seed for sesame. So I wouldn't want to recommend that.
Okay. All right. We have two more questions. What is the best method to control weeds in organic container-based cultivation? By hand, it's probably going to be if it's, but so this is for organic container-based cultivation.
Yeah, so if you have, it sort of depends.
Yeah.
If it's outdoors, um, because what I want to suggest is mulches. You can mulch those pots, right?
Yeah.
So things like, and it really depends on what you have available. I had a student, come up with a proposal to use rice hulls. So if you were somewhere near to where they grow rice and they have rice hulls, if it's like in a greenhouse situation and it's not gonna be windy and get blown out, then you can use things like rice hulls. But if it's outdoors, you need something heavier, right? That's not gonna blow away out of the pots.
Yeah.
So I would say mulching is your best bet.
Okay. Okay. So we pretty much, reached the end of our webinar. I want to thank Dr. Chase again for, providing us with so much really useful information. One of the things that Dr. Chase mentioned when she was talking about the last line of defense, where you're actually using allowed substances for those people that are here today who are certified organic farmers already, or anyone who is going to be maybe already in the process. Always check with your certifier, even though something might be OMRI approved. Farmers, producers are required to submit a list of all of their inputs. And that's very important. And when in doubt, check with someone who, you trust and is knowledgeable, once again, to be able to verify that that particular input is indeed allowed. You don't need to always purchase OMRI approved products because there's Washington State Department of Ag. Dr. Chase was mentioning, does reviews of materials as well. So it's always very important to make sure that you keep in mind that you can always check with a certifier if you know before you apply anything. Of course, that's really very important. Dr.
The
Chase,
other
any
thing
last
that's
words? Yes.
important
Mhm.
with that too is that even if your certifying agency approves it, you and they also need to ensure that in the case of Florida, that it has a Florida label, that it is
Yeah.
registered for use in Florida.
Yeah.
Because some of these products are not.
Yeah. Yeah. Good deal. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We want to thank Dr. Chase once again. Thank you for giving us such a great presentation, you know, so many excellent tips. We look forward to the next time, and we invite everyone to check our website for more webinars and upcoming events. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.